It's election day tomorrow here in the United States of America. And if you're a United States citizen, you have a duty to discharge.
Things we love and things we despise are on the ballot this year, and it's time for us to cast our votes and let our values be counted.
It's time for Americans to stand up tall and vote our values for every position and question on the ballot this year. I hope Americans vote to advance freedom and thwart the enemies of this land we love.
John Quincy Adams, the sixth president of the United States, not to be confused with his father, John Adams, who was the second president of the United States, said that duty is ours, results are God's.
He lived what he spoke. In 1830, he was elected to the House of Representatives immediately after he ended his term as president. And he wasn't even on the ballot. It was duty called, and he went and served. And he served until 1848 because he was so passionate about ending slavery in the United States. In fact, he was so adamant about it that the House made a resolution that he couldn't bring the subject up anymore because they were just tired of listening to him.
Well, they were tired of hearing it because there was a lot of division amongst the people. Did they want slavery? Did they not want slavery? Did they want to make any change, or did they just want to keep things as they were, as they understood them, what they were used to?
And this is an important fact about John Quincy Adams. In his lifetime, slavery wasn't abolished. But while he was serving on the House floor, he befriended a young representative from Illinois. And that young Illinois representative was only there for one term, and then he never came back to the House. But once John Quincy Adams died, that young representative from Illinois was elected president, and he did abolish slavery because that young representative was Abraham Lincoln.
Sometimes we never see the strings that connect all of us until after the fact, and why those relationships happened at the time that they did. It's amazing, the power of connections, those providential connections, many would say, where God puts his hand into the affairs of men and directs the results.
I think we have lost the sense of duty in our country. We talk about responsibility, and that's a different type of character. But, even George Washington, he didn't want to be the president of the Constitutional Congress. He didn't want to be the first president, but everybody wanted him to be. And so duty called him to serve his country. And, you think about it, he was in New York presiding over the country as president, and his wife, Martha, was back in the D.C. area on the farm. That was a huge distance in those days. They sacrificed tremendously for the love of their country and for the love of the people that were going to come after them, because they understood what tyranny was, and they didn't want American citizens to suffer from that kind of aristocratic rule over them.
It's important to vote. Freedom is God-given, but it doesn't happen naturally because man will naturally encroach upon it. Our founding fathers fought for freedom. They made enormous sacrifices in order to build the freedom, the environment of freedom that we have today. So one of the least things we can do, very little inconvenience really, is to vote and express our values.
And the importance of voting is that the founding fathers realized that, hey, we fought a war. Many of us died. Many of us gave up our life, our fortune, and everything that we had to make sure that this country would be free. And so we're going to make sure that continues to happen. So we're going to have elections, and the people are going to pick who rules over them every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years, depending on what office you're holding. So we don't have to fight a revolution. So voting is kind of like a mini revolution. We get to decide who's going to be our leaders.
Yeah, and we get to decide that with ballots instead of bullets.
I like that. You had statistics about our country declaring independence from Britain and what some of the taxation was, what some of the problems were that we cited that we didn't like, we wanted to become independent.
Well, the British king was imposing taxes and Parliament imposed taxes on American colonists. And the colonists didn't like paying these taxes the way that they were imposed, and because they had no representation in how they were taxed. But if you look back at the history, the taxes were relatively low. Americans were paying an estimated 1 to 1.5%, while British citizens were paying 5 to 7% in taxes at the time. So it wasn't necessarily the amount of the taxes, it was the principle that was wrong. They didn't like being taxed because they didn't have any representation in how they were.
And so when we get to vote, then we get to have representation. We get to say, no, you cannot raise our taxes, or you can raise our taxes for this reason, or we get to vote the people in who will make good laws about our taxes.
And Michelle, that's true, but only if we do our research. Because we can just vote like, oh, I'm going to vote for my sports team. I want them to win because we're one party or we're another party. But if we really do our due diligence and we figure out, hey, this person that I'm voting for wants to keep my taxes low, doesn't want to spend my money where I wouldn't spend my money, and actually wants to reduce the burden that the citizen has to pay to make this country run, that's the type of research that our founding fathers wanted us to do about who we vote for, not to say, well, I've been this party and my family's been this party for centuries and I'm going to vote party line regardless.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense. You want to vote for somebody based on character.
We want to vote on our values. Not, like you said, Tom, not the sports team, not the color of skin, not the gender, not the location in the U.S. We're voting our values. That's what's important.
Our system of taxation today naturally promotes division and creates different class systems. It's not a flat system of taxation, but it's a graduated income tax. Supposedly, the reasoning behind that is because it should be fair for everyone. So the rich should pay more than the poor, so that it kind of levels the playing field. That's the theory behind it, but it doesn't actually end up happening that way. Here are some statistics on it. The top 1% of income earners pay almost 50% of the income taxes. The top 5% pay over 65% of the income taxes. The top 10% pay over 75% of the income taxes. So the tax system is successful in getting the rich to pay more than the lower classes, but that's not solving the class divide in our country. In fact, it's accentuating it.
And really what's happening when these higher taxes are passed on to the wealthier individuals who are actually probably the producers providing jobs and manufacturing and whatnot in this country is the business owners. Those taxes are paid by the corporation, but who actually gives the corporations the money for those taxes? It's the middle class and the lower class. We have to pay higher prices so they can afford those taxes. So someone that says, we're going to tax the rich, guess what? You, as a lower middle class person, financially, are going to be the one that foot the bill.
So we hear this talk about, well, these greedy corporations. Well, that's not the real problem. They're simply passing on their cost of doing business, and the people that buy the products are facing the real increases. So yeah, we're not paying the taxes per se, but we're paying the taxes through the price of higher products.
Recently, we held an event right here in Franklin, Indiana, in our barn about freedom. And we had people come from at least 3 different states surrounding our state. We had close to 200 people there, and they were so excited to hear about what our vote does and how it works and what the founding fathers set up for us so that we didn't have to pick up rifles and ammunition, that we could just go to the ballot box and cast a ballot instead of a bullet. And everyone said it was a wonderful event. And we live in a wonderful country, and we need to keep it that way.
I remember someone in our family, my brother, was talking to a friend of ours, and they were talking politics. And they really got into it. This gentleman was upset about some things that were happening in our country. But then it came out that he didn't vote in the last election. And, well, you don't have a right to complain about these things if you don't take the time to go and vote. That's the least you can do. And some people show up to vote and they complain about the choices that are on the ballot. Well, if you didn't have a hand in determining those choices on the ballot, if you didn't get in the kitchen ahead of time, you really don't have a right to complain about that. And so we need to remember that as we're talking politics, as we're expressing and trying to live out the values in our life, we need to make sure that we're putting in the time so that we have a right to discuss and try to change the results if we don't like the outcome.
And sadly to say, there's two groups that are notoriously known for not voting. And that is people that declare their Christianity and people that are gun owners.
As an example, 49% of people of faith do not plan to vote in the upcoming election, according to a recent survey.
With that survey, they're saying if those people in California, those people of faith, would cast their vote, that they could turn California around. That's how powerful your vote could be. When we get back from the break, we're going to talk about how to choose between two bad candidates and how to know who to vote for when you don't know any of the candidates.
Ken is a client of McPhee Insurance. In 2008, he lost about half of his investments. That was before he was a client, but he had been following conventional financial wisdom to a T. Many people don't put enough money away for their retirement, but Ken did put money away for his retirement. He says the most frustrating thing when 2008 came along, he had been putting money away for 35 years, and it hadn't grown to what he expected it should have. Then 2008 came along, and it took half of it away. He really felt like he was backpedaling instead of making progress the way he should. That's when Ken discovered using life insurance as a financial tool with the infinite banking concept. He says not only does it give him more stability with his finances, but it puts him back in control instead of giving control to somebody else. Many people find out about using life insurance as a financial tool during an economic downturn or a market crash. And while it's good they're getting the coverage they need, we really wish we could turn the clock back for these people so they could have the good life insurance in place before the economic downturn or the market crash. Because good life insurance helps you to keep more of the money that you make, grow your wealth, and have financial peace of mind even during turbulent economic times. To get the good life insurance you need, call McPhee Insurance at 702-660-7000. Call us sooner than later.
Here we approach maybe the most difficult part of the podcast, and that is how do we decide between two candidates that we don't really care for either one?
No candidate is ever going to be perfect. So we're going to have to make judgments or discern between the differences between what they support. No system of government is even perfect. That's the beauty of the system that the American founding fathers set up for us. They didn't create a democracy because they realized that democracies have violent endings and they tend to be short-lived. They created a republic where we had different forms of representation. So the people were represented in Congress, you had the states that were represented in the Senate, and the president was chosen through a combination of the methods where the people had a voice and the vote had to be spread over a sufficient geographic area. That's the beauty of the Electoral College. It takes both of those into consideration.
Now, today we're facing a group of people in a political class that says, we need to elect our president by the popular vote because the Electoral College is weighted. It goes against the people's will. What they're calling for is a massive revolt because that's what ends democracies, the mob rule type thing. The founding fathers were very, very specific in saying, no, we want our president to be elected by a group of electors or the Electoral College, where people from each state are appointed either by the people or by the state legislature to cast the vote. So when you cast your vote for the presidency, you're electing the Electoral College to go represent you to pick your president. Now, the people that are for this say, oh, the people's will is being violated with the Electoral College. But the founding fathers understood this. So let's give it a little example about how this works. In 1960, the Pirates won the World Series over the Yankees, even though the Yankees scored a whole lot more runs than the Pirates did. So should we say, oh, the people who won the most points should win the World Series? Or should we stick by the rules and say whoever won the most games out of the 7 that they played will win the series?
So the electoral college is like who won the most games, the way that the baseball actually scored. The popular vote would be like whoever run the most runs across those games.
And it gives the underdogs, the people that aren't represented as much in rural America and states that don't have as many people as New York or Los Angeles or Houston, have a voice in who their president is.
That's important because otherwise you have division at a crazy level. And we don't have to look that far back to see an example of how this is played out. It used to be that the senators were elected by the state legislatures. And so they gave the states a voice in the federal government process. That's no longer the case because the 17th Amendment in 1913 changed the way that senators are elected. Now senators are elected by the population in those states. So you have 2 senators per state, and they're elected by the population of those states instead of the state legislators. Well, when the state legislators would elect the senators were more directly accountable to that group of people. It was a smaller group of people. They could hold them more accountable when they were stepping on the rights of the states. That check is no longer in place, and so we see the size of the federal government ballooning since that amendment was passed.
Right. So the people, the general population, could vote for their state representatives, and then the state representatives had direct results on who the senators were, and they could control them more easily. So we, the people, had our voice through the representatives, and now we also vote for the Senate, but we have less control on the senators and what happens.
It also invited more foreign money to be put into the senator's race. And I'm saying even foreign money from other states going into a state to try to influence what maybe California does versus Nevada. Now Nevada might be more influenced by California's money than they were by Nevada representation.
So I think Amendment 17 is a good example for us to realize that the Electoral College that was set up is really a good and fair thing, and we should be glad that that's in place. And now let's do the part that we can do, which is voting. And now let's really go to a discussion about how are we going to choose the people that are on the ballot.
Well, you're listening to Wealth Talks, and one of the major things that we should be thinking about is the person that you're going to cast your vote for. Do they favor more freedom or more regulation? It's been proven that more regulation is more costly to us than actually higher taxes. So if you're voting for people that want to regulate other people, regulate corporations, regulate business, regulate commerce more, you're voting to spend higher dollars on the goods and services that you purchase.
Regulations, that's a huge thing because you hear about the police officers who would make more arrests or be on the street more, except they've got to go back in and do all their paperwork. You hear about teachers who would spend more time teaching the students, but they've got to do all the record keeping and, all their paperwork. You hear about it in every profession. There's the people who want to do construction and build buildings, but they've got all the regulations and the licenses and the permits and everything. We could reduce regulations and have a freer, more productive life.
And it affects us all the way down to healthcare. I remember when your dad was in the hospital and the nurses would come in, they would go over to the computer and type their records and barely glance at your father. He was in the hospital bed there. And we were just appalled that this is healthcare today.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the regulations. If they don't keep those, if they do not keep those records, then they are in violation and they can't bill Medicare or they can't bill some other health institute or insurance company. And so it comes down to regulations that prevent us from having the freedom and the liberty that our founding fathers fought and died for.
So looking at our pocketbook and how the policies of a candidate that is running will affect that could be a good thing. It's a standard of measurement. Now, some people will say, well, if you're just looking at your pocketbook, you're just greedy. That's all you're looking at. And some people are greedy. That's all that they care about. But if you use it as a standard of measurement, that's absolutely one of the ways that we measure the degree of freedom. How much are we able to produce and service our fellow human beings and earn an income off of it? That helps to promote freedom.
So now, how do you choose a candidate if you don't know anything about them? You could do Google searches, but there's a lot of things that happen in the SEO world that may thwart your search there for accurate information. There's a lot of misinformation you could find in that way. So I think it's great to go to your connections and ask them, people you respect. Ask them, who do you suggest? What do you think the differences are between this candidate and that candidate? And, very often we have people, in fact, we still have people contact us from Nevada and say, hey, do you still have a pulse on these candidates? Who do you recommend? And we can look at them and give recommendations.
Often we know.
Yeah, if we know, we'll let them know. We talk with friends. What have you heard? What do you know? What has been their record? And we compare notes. And that it can be a great way to find out about candidates.
The other way is to get involved in the political process. Go to your party meetings. And if you can't, befriend someone that does, so that you have an inside story of what's happened in the political scene in your state. Another way is to look at, when we're looking at senators or presidential candidates, who did those presidential candidates appoint as judges? What senators voted for the appointment of certain judges? And how are those judges ruling? Are they taking away your freedoms, or are they loosening regulations to give you more freedoms?
And that takes a little bit of research. That type of information, the factual pieces, are easily accessible on the internet. Okay, so when we're doing an internet search, there's some great information that can be online. There's also some bad information that can be online. And so we always have to have our thinking cap on and be on the alert to discern what type of information we're looking at.
I think another way is to look at who you voted in past elections. If they're running again, are you pleased with what they've done for you? Are you pleased with how they've deregulated things and made your life freer? Or are you upset that they violated your values, which they promised they wouldn't the last time you voted for them? I remember we were doing a town hall meeting with a representative or a potential representative, and he wouldn't answer my questions on vaccinations or the ownership of handguns. He evaded that question. And I called him again. I met him at another event, and he still wouldn't. He promised he would, so I called him, and he hadn't. So I sent him a text message, and he got mad at me because I told him that he hadn't honored his word. He hadn't answered me. He's never going to get my vote.
Sometimes it's hard to know how to vote for judges. In Indiana, our state, you can vote to retain or remove a judge after they have been appointed. Well, sometimes it's hard to find information about judges online. You can look at some of their rulings sometimes, but if you can't find that information, then look at who appointed that judge. If you're a fan of their policies and the way that they have been governing, and that can give you a pointer on whether to retain or remove a judge.
I'd like to read this quote by John Jay, the first Supreme Court Justice. All that the best men can do is to persevere in doing their duty to their country and leave the consequences to him who made it their duty. Being neither elated by success, however great, nor discouraged by disappointment, however frequent and mortifying. We must go home to be happy, and our home is not in this world. Here we have nothing to do but our duty, and by it to regulate our business and our pleasure.
You may have heard freedom isn't free. That's true. Voting is one of the duties that comes with the freedom our forefathers gave to us. If we exercise our duty clearly and responsibly and vote our values, then the freedom we have to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness will be retained. But if we fail and shirk our duty and don't vote, then the freedoms that we do have will be taken away.
To all U.S. citizens who haven't voted yet, do your research, make phone calls, talk to people, send emails, texts, do internet searches. Whatever you need to do, find out which candidates are most worthy of your vote and decide on every ballot question. Then get to the polls and vote. If you spend from now Until the polls close and barely squeak in to cast your vote, we believe it'll be worth it.
If every American does their duty and votes, I believe we'll soon have a stronger, more prosperous, and safer country with liberty and justice for all. We're approaching episode 500 of the Wealth Talks podcast, and we would like to ask you a favor. Would you please go and review the podcast? We would greatly appreciate it. And if you haven't voted yet, do that first, because that is one of the most important things you can do. We'll be back next week. Thanks for listening.